My name is Claudine, and I was 34 years old when my in-laws listed my house for sale while I was still in a hospital bed recovering from surgery. They didn't ask me. They didn't tell me. I found out because my neighbor, a retired woman named Bev who had lived 3 houses down from me for 11 years, texted me a screenshot of the listing. The photos were taken from inside my home. My furniture was still in them. My mother-in-law's explanation when I finally reached her was 7 words. "You're not family anymore. This is practical." I didn't argue. I didn't cry into the phone. I asked her who had authorized the listing, and she said the family had discussed it and agreed it was the right thing, and then she said she had to go. What she didn't know, what none of them had thought to check, because it had never occurred to them that I might have gotten there first, was that the house had a history that predated my marriage by a significant distance. There was a deed. It was filed correctly. And when the title officer pulled the full chain of title at the closing, the number she read aloud stopped the entire room. I wasn't in that room when it happened, but I heard about it in detail, from 3 separate people, that same afternoon. Welcome back to the channel, where quiet people let the paperwork arrive before they do. If this one lands close to home, hit subscribe and leave a comment. I read every single one, but I want to tell you about the house before I tell you about what happened to it, because the house is the whole story. Not just the legal part, the actual story, the one that explains why any of this matters at all. I grew up in Denton, Texas, in a family that had modest money and immodest expectations. My father, Warren, was a licensed surveyor who spent 30 years drawing property lines for other people, and took a particular pride in understanding exactly where things began and ended. He was not a sentimental man in the conventional sense. He didn't give speeches or tell you he loved you in so many words, but he expressed care through precision. He kept his tools calibrated. He paid his taxes early. He kept paper records of every financial transaction he had been part of since 1987, organized in green hanging folders in a cabinet in his home office that smelled like dust and old ink. He bought the house on Aldercrest Drive in 1999, when I was 7 years old. It was a 3-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot in a neighborhood that was neither expensive nor neglected. The kind of street where people mowed their own lawns and knew their neighbors' first names and showed up with food when someone had surgery. The house had good bones, my father always said. He meant it architecturally, but I think he also meant it in some other sense, the way people mean it when they are talking about something they intend to keep. He did keep it. For 22 years he owned that house outright, paid off the original mortgage in 14 years, maintained it consistently, re-roofed it in 2011 and replumbed it in 2016 and repainted the exterior every 5 years without fail. He lived in it alone after my mother moved to be closer to her sister in New Mexico, and the arrangement suited him. He had his office, he had his tools in the garage, he had Bev 3 houses down who brought him soup when he had a cold and who he helped with her taxes every February in return. I had lived in the house during summers home from college and for about 8 months after graduation while I figured out what came next. What came next turned out to be a job at a regional architecture firm in Fort Worth, which was 40 minutes from Denton, and an apartment closer to the office. I moved out when I was 23. My father and I talked on the phone twice a week. I drove up most Sundays for dinner. I got married when I was 28. His name was Mitchell Pierce, and I want to be clear that what happened later was not entirely about Mitchell, it was about his family, his mother Diane in particular, and the way the Pierce family operated as a unit that had its own internal logic and its own definition of how things should be arranged. Mitchell was a decent man who had grown up inside that logic for so long that he sometimes couldn't see the edges of it. We had a small wedding. My father came. The Pierces came in force, Diane and her husband Gerald, Mitchell's 2 sisters, an assortment of cousins and aunts. They were a sociable, organized family who held opinions about most things and expressed them freely. Within about 6 months of our marriage, Diane had opinions about where we lived, too far from the Pierce side, where we banked, she preferred a different institution, and how we should be thinking about our financial future. Real estate, she said, was the only thing that held its value, and we should be looking at something in the Pierce family's neighborhood in Grapevine. I listened to all of this. Mitchell listened to all of this. We did not move to Grapevine. My father's health began to decline when I was 31. It was not dramatic or sudden. It was the slow accumulation of things that accumulate in a man in his late 60s who has worked outdoors his whole life and who has not, if he's honest, been to a doctor with any consistency since his mid-50s. His knees had been unreliable for years. His blood pressure, it turned out, had been quietly elevated for longer than anyone knew. He had a minor cardiac event in the spring of that year. Not a full heart attack, the doctors were careful to say, but a serious warning, the kind that reorganizes a person's understanding of time. He called me the week after he came home from the hospital. We talked for a long time. He was characteristically direct. He said he had been thinking about the house and about what he wanted to do with it, and that he had been in touch with his attorney about his options. He said he had decided on a specific arrangement and that he had executed the paperwork, and that I should know about it so I wasn't surprised later. He had transferred the deed to me. Not in a will, not as an inheritance contingent on his death, but as an outright transfer, a deed of gift recorded with the Denton County Clerk's office, effective immediately. The house was mine. He would continue to live in it for as long as he was able, and I would not charge him rent, and we both understood that arrangement without having to say it out loud. But legally the ownership had changed. The deed bore my name. It had been filed and recorded and was part of the public record. He told me this and then he said, "I'm not going to make a big thing of it, but I wanted you to know it's done." I asked him if he had told anyone else. He said he saw no reason to. I understood what he meant. He had done what he always did. He had drawn the line precisely, filed the documentation correctly, and trusted that the record would speak for itself when the time came. I did not tell Mitchell. Not immediately. This is something I have thought about since, and I want to be honest with you about it. I didn't tell him for two reasons. The first was that it felt like my father's business, private in the way that deliberate acts of care are sometimes private, something between the two of us that didn't require announcement. The second reason, if I am being truthful, was Diane. I had watched her for 3 years organize her opinions about things that were not her business with a fluency that suggested she did not recognize the category. I did not want her to have an opinion about the house on Aldercrest Drive, so I didn't say anything. I told Mitchell that my father had updated his estate documents, which was true, and I left it at that. My father continued to live in the house. I continued to drive up on Sundays. Bev continued to bring him soup. Things were, in the way that stable things are, unremarkable. The marriage became difficult in the second year and harder in the third. I am not going to litigate it here. It is not the story I am telling, and it is not what this is about. What I will say is that by the time I was 33, Mitchell and I had been separated for 7 months, that the separation had been initiated by me, and that the process of formally ending the marriage was underway in the slow, grinding way that these processes tend to be when one party's family has strong opinions about outcomes. Diane's opinion, communicated to me through Mitchell and then eventually directly, was that the separation was my fault, that I had not been adequately committed to the family, and that the appropriate resolution involved me making certain concessions that she described as just being reasonable. I did not engage with this framing. My attorney engaged with it on my behalf. My father died in October of the following year. It was his heart, finally and completely. He was 69. He died in the house on Aldercrest Drive, which was, I think, what he would have chosen if the choice were his to make. I was 34. I was still technically married. The divorce had not been finalized. And I was, without knowing that any of this was about to happen, about to spend 3 days in a hospital myself. The surgery was not serious in the sense of being life-threatening. It was a procedure I had needed for about 2 years and had postponed for about 2 years, and after my father died I made the appointment and scheduled it and went in at the beginning of November. I was told I would be there 2 to 3 days. I told Mitchell's attorney's office, because we were still in communication through that channel. I told a colleague at work. I told Bev, who said she would keep an eye on things. I did not tell Diane. There was no version of that conversation I wanted to have. I went in on a Wednesday morning. The procedure went well. I was in recovery by early afternoon, in a room by evening, and by the following morning I was sitting up and eating hospital food and answering work emails on my phone. That's when Bev's text came. She had sent it with the caption, "Claudine, honey, is this right? I saw a sign this morning and then looked online." And then the screenshot, a real estate listing with the address of the house on Aldercrest Drive with 6 photographs. The living room, the kitchen, the backyard, my father's office, which still had his green hanging folders visible on the shelf in the background. The listing price was $420,000. I looked at the photographs for a long time. My hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning, and my chest felt like something had been placed on it. Not a pain, just a weight, solid and immediate. I called Mitchell. He did not answer. I called Diane directly. She answered on the third ring. She said, and I want to give you her exact words because they matter, she said. The house is part of the marital estate, Claudine. We had it appraised. Mitchell's attorney says it needs to be liquidated as part of the settlement, and with you in the hospital, we thought it was better to move forward. You're not really family anymore. This is just practical. I said. Who authorized the listing? She said. We all talked about it. Mitchell agreed it was the right thing. I said. Diane, I need you to pull the listing. She said, in the tone of someone explaining something to a person who is being unnecessarily difficult. The listing is live. We've already had 2 showings. I really think you should talk to your attorney and stop making this harder than it needs to be. Then she said she had to go. I put the phone down on my chest and looked at the ceiling of my hospital room for a moment. My jaw was tight. My throat had that specific closed quality that happens when something large is trying to come up and you are deciding not to let it. I picked the phone back up. I called my attorney. Her name was Petra Solis, and she had been handling my divorce proceedings for 8 months at that point. I told her what had happened and there was a pause and then she said, They listed it without your consent. Yes, I said. As marital property. Yes. Another pause. A shorter one this time. Claudine, whose name is on the deed? Mine, I said. Only mine. It was transferred to me by my father 3 years ago. It's recorded with Denton County. There was a silence that had a different quality than the previous silences. And Mitchell's name was never added. Never. Does he know about the transfer? I told him my father had updated his estate documents. I never specified what that meant. And Diane? No. Petra said. All right. I need you to rest. I'm going to make some calls. I said. There's a closing scheduled, Petra. If there's already been showings. I know, she said. Rest. I'll handle the timeline. I put the phone down again and I did what she said. Not because I wasn't worried but because there was nothing else I could do from a hospital room in Denton that Petra could not do better from her office in Fort Worth. I had the documentation. It was filed. My father had been a methodical man. I trusted the record. The betrayal in full, witnesses noted. What happened over the next 9 days while I was in the hospital and then at home recovering was a set of events I am going to describe to you in the order in which I learned about them because I think that order matters. Day 1. Petra contacted the listing agent and notified her that the property was not marital property and that the listing had been placed without the owner's authorization. The listing agent, a woman named Sherry, said she had been provided documentation by the family, indicating that the property was part of a marital estate undergoing dissolution. Petra told her that the documentation was incorrect and that she was prepared to demonstrate that with the recorded deed, which was public record and accessible to anyone who looked. Sherry said she would need to speak with her broker. Day 2, Mitchell called me. This was the first time he had called me directly in about 3 months. His voice had the careful quality of someone who has been coached. He said, I need you to understand that the listing wasn't meant to be aggressive. My mother thought it would simplify things. I said, Mitchell, the house isn't marital property. My name has been on that deed for 3 years. There was a pause. What? My father transferred it to me in 2021. It's recorded. A longer pause. I didn't know that. I know you didn't, I said. He said. My mother said it was in your father's estate. It was in my name before he passed, I said. It has never been part of his estate or our marital estate. He was quiet for long enough that I could hear him processing the geometry of this, the way a fact, when it is precise enough, rearranges everything around it. Then he said, I'm going to need to talk to my attorney. I said, that's probably a good idea. Day 4. The real estate agent's broker reached out to Petra and confirmed that the listing would be suspended pending clarification of ownership. Diane called me that evening. Her voice had changed, not the tone exactly, but the register underneath the tone, the thing that carries the actual emotional content. She said, Your attorney is being very aggressive about this. I said, She's doing her job. This is a family matter, Diane said. It doesn't need to involve a lawyer. Diane, I said. The house has been listed without my consent. I am currently recovering from surgery in my home. I think it does need to involve a lawyer. We thought, she stopped. She started again. The family agreed that the property was part of the settlement. Mitchell's attorney said. Mitchell's attorney was working from an incorrect assumption about ownership, I said. The deed is public record. Anyone could have checked. There was a silence. Your father transferred it to you? 3 years ago, I said. She said nothing for a moment. Then, why didn't you say something? I thought about the right answer to that. I said. It didn't come up. That was the end of the conversation. She said she needed to think and I said fine and we hung up. Day 6. Petra told me that Mitchell's attorney had confirmed, after reviewing the recorded deed, that the property was not part of the marital estate and would be removed from the settlement proceedings. This was the correct legal outcome. It was not, however, the end of things, because there was a buyer. Sherry, the listing agent, had, in the 2 days before the listing was suspended, accepted an offer. The buyer had signed a purchase agreement. A closing date had been set. And even though the listing had been suspended, the buyer's attorney was arguing that the executed purchase agreement obligated the sellers, meaning in their framing the marital estate, to complete the transaction. Petra explained this to me on day 6 with the careful precision of someone who wants you to understand the situation completely without panicking. The buyer's attorney is arguing that the agreement was signed in good faith, she said. We are arguing that it cannot be enforced because the sellers did not have the authority to enter into the agreement. The property was never theirs to sell. What happens at the closing? I asked. The title officer will pull the full chain of title before any transfer can be recorded, Petra said. That is standard procedure. When she does, she will see your deed. She will see that it predates the listing by 3 years and that your name, and only your name, appears as owner. And then she will note the discrepancy and the transfer cannot proceed, Petra said. The title cannot be conveyed because the sellers do not hold it. Will she say that out loud? At the closing table. She will be required to, Petra said. She can't process a transfer she cannot certify. I said. Who will be at the closing? She told me. Mitchell, Diane, Gerald, the buyer and her attorney, the listing agent, and the title officer, a woman named Frances Doyle, who worked for a title company in Denton, and who had, according to Petra, a reputation for being thorough. I asked Petra if I needed to be there. She said, You don't have to be. The title officer will do what she does regardless of whether you're present. But it might be useful for you to be in the building. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for about 45 seconds. Then I called Bev and asked if she could drive me. I was still recovering and wasn't supposed to be driving yet. Bev said absolutely. What time? The closing was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9:30 at the title company's office on Bell Avenue in Denton. Bev drove me in her Subaru and parked in the lot and asked if I wanted her to come in. I said no, thank you, I would be all right. She said she'd wait. I walked in at 9:22. The receptionist checked me in. I had told Petra to notify the title company that I would be present as the property owner, which meant I was entitled to be there regardless of what any other party preferred. I was shown to a small waiting area outside the closing room. Through the glass panel beside the door I could see the conference table. Diane was already seated, Gerald beside her, Mitchell at the far end, in a jacket he usually wore to things he considered formal. The buyer, a woman in her late 40s who I had never met, sat across from them with her attorney. Sherry, the listing agent, sat to one side with a folder open in front of her. They had not been told I was in the building. I sat in the waiting area and did not go in. Not yet. Petra had advised me to let the process run until the title officer reached the deed, and to be available if I was needed. I was available. I sat in a chair outside the glass panel with my hands in my lap, and my coat folded over my arm, and I watched Frances Doyle arrange her materials at the head of the table. Frances Doyle was a compact woman, maybe 60, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the specific unhurried quality of someone who has conducted this same process several hundred times and has learned not to rush any of it. She distributed copies of the documents to each party. She reviewed the purchase agreement. She went through the preliminary items, identification, confirmation of parties, review of the transaction terms. Then she picked up the title report. I watched her read. She read the way professionals read documents that contain information, not scanning, actually reading line by line down the page. She got approximately 2/3 of the way down and stopped. She looked up. She looked at Sherry. She looked back at the document. She set it down and picked up what appeared to be a second document, the actual deed records pulled as part of the title search, and read that as well. Her expression did not change. It was the expression of a person who has found a discrepancy and is confirming the discrepancy before she presents it, because she is a professional and professionals confirm before they speak. She set the second document down beside the first. She said, "I need to pause the closing." The room shifted. Not loudly. Nobody knocked anything over or raised their voice, but in the way that rooms shift when an authority figure says something unexpected. The buyer's attorney looked up. Mitchell looked at Francis. Diane looked at Sherry. Sherry said, "Is there a problem with the title search?" Francis said, "There is an issue with the chain of title that I need to address before we can proceed." She held up the deed record. The property at this address was conveyed by deed of gift in October 2021 from the previous owner of record to a third party. The deed was recorded with the Denton County Clerk's Office at that time, and is part of the public record. The buyer's attorney said, "A third party?" "The current owner of record," Francis said. "The deed was not transferred back at any subsequent point. The property has been in the name of the current owner of record continuously since October 2021. Mitchell had gone very still at the far end of the table. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table's surface, were no longer casual. They had stopped moving entirely. Diane said, "I don't understand. The property is part of the marital estate." Francis said, "The property was recorded as individually owned prior to the marriage." She looked at the deed record again. 11 years prior to the marriage, in fact. A silence. 11 years, the buyer's attorney repeated. "The current owner of record acquired the property in 2021, Francis said. "The marriage you are referring to took place in 2018. The property was in the name of the previous owner, the current owner's father, at the time of the marriage, and was transferred to the current owner 3 years after the marriage, but the question of marital inclusion is not the operative issue here. The operative issue is that the sellers at this table are not the owners of record, and do not have the legal authority to convey this title." Diane said, "Who is the current owner of record?" Francis looked at her with an evenness that had no apology in it. "Claudine Marsh." The receptionist knocked on the glass panel and opened the door. She said, "Miss Marsh? Miss Doyle is ready for you." I stood up. I put on my coat. I walked through the door into the closing room. I have thought about that moment many times since. What I remember most is not the expressions, though I remember those too, but the quality of the silence. It was the silence of a room in which something has been resolved, even if the people in the room have not yet caught up to the resolution. It was complete. It was the silence of a finished thing. Diane's face had gone the color of old paper. Gerald had his hands flat on the table and was looking at a point somewhere between the documents and the middle distance. Mitchell was looking at me. His expression was not angry. It was something more complicated than anger. The expression of a person who is recalculating backward through a sequence of events and finding that each step looks different than it had a moment ago. The buyer's attorney was writing something in her notepad. I sat down next to Frances Doyle. She said, "Ms. Marsh, I've confirmed that you are the owner of record for the property at this address. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said. "And you did not authorize the listing or the sale of this property?" "No," I said. She made a notation. "Then I'm unable to certify this title transfer. The closing cannot proceed." She looked around the table. "I would suggest all parties speak with their respective attorneys before taking any further action." The buyer's attorney said, "We have an executed purchase agreement." Francis said, "You have an executed purchase agreement with parties who did not have the authority to sell. I'd recommend discussing with counsel what remedies are available to your client." She said it without inflection. She had probably said something like it before. It was not her job to manage what happened next, it was her job to certify what was true, and she had done that. I sat in that room for another 12 minutes while the formal closeout of the process was completed. Documents noting the failure to transfer, copies distributed, Frances completing her record. I did not look at Diane for most of it. When I did briefly, her eyes were on the table. When it was over, I thanked Frances Doyle, shook her hand, and walked back out through the waiting area, where Bev was now sitting because the receptionist had offered her a seat when it became clear the closing was running long. Bev looked at my face and said, "Do you want coffee?" I said yes. We drove to a diner on the other side of town and I ordered coffee and eggs and I sat across from Bev in a booth and I told her what had happened. She listened to the whole thing. When I was done, she said, "Your father would have loved that." I thought about him. About the green hanging folders. About the way he had said, "On that phone call, I'm not going to make a big thing of it. But I wanted you to know it's done." "Yes," I said. He would have. The calls started that afternoon. Mitchell called first about 2 hours after I got home. He said, "I genuinely didn't know Claudine." "I know," I said. "My mother." He stopped. "She told me the property was part of the estate. She said her attorney had confirmed it." "Her attorney confirmed what she told him," I said, "which wasn't accurate." He was quiet. "The buyer's attorney is saying there may be liability for entering into a purchase agreement we didn't have the authority to sign." "That's between you and your attorney," I said. "Claudine." His voice had something in it that I hadn't heard in a long time, something genuinely without strategy. "I'm sorry. What happened? I'm sorry." I believed him. That part one believed. "I know," I said again. And then I told him I needed to rest, which was true, and we said goodbye. Diane called that evening. She had clearly spent the afternoon thinking about what to say, because she led with, "I want you to know that I was trying to do what was best for everyone." This was such a thorough reframing of events that I almost said something. Instead, I let her continue. She said that her attorney had advised her that the marital property claim was straightforward, that she hadn't known about the deed transfer, that she was sorry for the distress this had caused, and that she hoped we could handle the rest of the proceedings in a civilized way. I said, "Diane, I'm still recovering from surgery." A pause. "I know," she said. It was bad timing. "I understand that." "The listing went up 3 days after I went into the hospital," I said. Another pause. Yes. "I need to rest," I said. "My attorney will be in touch." Her sister-in-law, Mitchell's younger sister Kay, texted me 2 days later. Kay and I had gotten along reasonably well during the marriage, and the text was in the key of that reasonableness. "Hey, I want you to know I didn't know about any of this until after. That wasn't okay. I'm sorry." I wrote back, "Thank you." That was the end of that conversation and it was fine. The buyer's attorney sent a formal communication to Petra about potential claims arising from the failed closing. Petra handled it. It took about 6 weeks and a mediator and did not result in anything that materially affected me, because I had authorized nothing and had, in fact, actively opposed the sale from a hospital bed as soon as I learned about it. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The house on Aldercrest Drive was not part of it. It was mine, as it had been mine since October 2021, as my father had made certain it would be when he picked up the phone and called his attorney and told him what he wanted to do and then signed the documents that had been prepared and had them properly witnessed and notarized and filed with the county. He had been a surveyor. He understood property lines. He had drawn them for other people his entire career and he knew, with the precision of a man who has spent a lifetime at that work, exactly how to draw one that would hold. I drove up to the house on Aldercrest Drive about 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I let myself in with my key, which had always been my key because the house had always been mine, even when I hadn't thought about it that way. I walked through the rooms. My father's green hanging folders were still on the shelf in the back office. I hadn't moved them. I sat in the kitchen for a while. The window over the sink looked out at the backyard, where my father had kept a small vegetable garden that had gone fallow over the last year. The raised beds were still there. The soil was dry and cracked and needed attention. I thought about what to do with the house. I had not decided. I didn't need to decide immediately. The lease arrangement my father and I had discussed, the one in which he would live there for as long as he was able, and I would not charge him rent, had resolved itself in the way that arrangements like that eventually resolve themselves by the passage of time. What remained was a 3-bedroom craftsman on a corner lot in a neighborhood where people mowed their own lawns and knew their neighbors' first names. It had good bones. My father had always said so. I thought he was right. I got up and made myself a cup of coffee with the coffee maker that had been in that kitchen since I was a teenager, and I stood at the window and looked at the raised beds and thought about what to plant in the spring.